When prisons erupt, the deadliest inmate fights in history. Inside these walls, time moves differently. Respect is currency, fear is a weapon. And when that balance shatters, chaos explodes. These aren't just prison fights. These are wars, moments when entire facilities became battlegrounds, leaving trails of blood, fire, and death in their wake. Tonight we're going inside the deadliest inmate fights in history. From spontaneous brawls that spiraled into bloodbaths to calculated ambushes that turned cell blocks into war zones. These are the moments when prisons erupted and survival came down to nothing but instinct. When prisons erupt, the deadliest inmate fights in history, the pressure cooker. To understand how these fights happen, you need to see prison for what it truly is, a pressure cooker. Every day, thousands of men crammed into cages, stripped of freedom, fueled by resentment. Rival gangs run politics like governments. Every glance, every word, every gesture can spark violence. One of the deadliest examples? The infamous Attica Uprising. What started as a standoff over basic human rights, food, medical care, dignity, exploded into one of the bloodiest prison conflicts America had ever seen. Guards versus inmates, inmates versus inmates. And when the smoke cleared, 43 people were dead. But Attica was just the beginning. From the United States to Brazil, from Mexico to Venezuela, prisons worldwide have seen eruptions so violent they shook entire nations. Bloodbath in Carandiru, October 2nd, 1992. Sao Paulo, Brazil. What became known as the Carandiru Massacre wasn't just an inmate fight, it was a slaughter. Over 8,000 prisoners packed into one of the most overcrowded prisons on earth. Tensions were always high. That day, a fight broke out between rival gangs. Fists turned to knives, knives turned to shanks, and then the military code. Lice stormed in. What followed was 30 minutes of pure hell. Gunfire ripped through the cell blocks. Prisoners screamed, begged, hid under bunks. By the time the gun smoke cleared, 111 inmates lay dead, most shot at close range. Survivors described it not as a fight, but as a massacre. The deadliest prison fight in recorded history didn't just stain Brazil's justice system. It became a symbol of what happens when control collapses and raw violence takes over. Rikers Island, chaos in the city. Closer to home, Rikers Island in New York City is infamous for chaos. It's been called the nation's most notorious jail. Overcrowding, gangs, and corruption turned Rikers into a powder keg where fights are daily survival. In 2015, footage leaked of a fight in Rikers where inmates armed with shanks and razors turned a cell block into a gladiator pit. Guards stood by, overwhelmed, dozens injured. Some nearly killed. One inmate later testified, once it starts, you can't stop it. You fight or you die. Rikers fights don't always make headlines, but ask anyone who's been inside. But it's constant war. And when the gangs decide to move, entire housing units erupt in violence. Pelican Bay, the Gladiator arena. In the United States, no prison embodies inmate warfare like Pelican Bay. Built in the late 1980s, it was designed for one purpose: to cage the most violent offenders and cut off gang power. But inside these walls, something else happened. Pelican Bay became the front line in California's gang wars, the place where the state's most dangerous men turned yards into killing fields. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Pelican Bay witnessed what inmates called gladiator fights. Rival gangs, Norteños, Sureños, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, would be released into the yard, often in pairs. Guards, sometimes accused of staging it, watched as men went at each other with fists, blades, and sharpened steel. The fights didn't end until someone was bleeding on the ground. It was like Roman gladiators. You knew the second that gate opened, it was life or death. Nobody went in unarmed. In one notorious incident, a Norteño and Sureño clash spiraled into a yard-wide riot. Prisoners armed with homemade spears and blades fought under the towers as gunfire cracked from above. By the end, bodies were carried out on stretchers. Dozens wounded, some dead. Pelican Bay's name would forever be tied to organized gang warfare. Venezuela's Tocorón, a prison run by prisoners. Now imagine a prison where the guards don't run the show, where inmates live in luxury, complete with nightclubs, restaurants, even a zoo. That's Tocorón prison in Venezuela. For years, it was less a correctional facility and more a criminal kingdom. Inside, gangs ran everything, thus drugs, weapons, even internet scams reaching across the globe. But behind the chaos was a violent order, one enforced by the so-called prawn, or inmate boss. Rivalries weren't settled in courts. They were settled with machetes, rifles, and grenades. When Tocorón erupted, the violence was apocalyptic. Entire housing blocks turned into war zones. Grenades detonated in courtyards. Families of inmates trapped inside fled in terror. The government tried and failed repeatedly to regain control until 2023, when Venezuelan forces finally stormed the prison. What they found shocked the world. A fortress run by criminals, stocked with weapons, drugs, and even exotic animals. Tocorón wasn't just a prison fight. It was a war, a reminder that when the balance of power flips, prisons stop being cages and start being kingdoms. Mexico, cartel carnage. Few places on earth see prison violence like Mexico. Here, cartels don't just fight on the streets. They bring their wars inside prison walls. And when they clash, the result is pure carnage. In 2010, one of the bloodiest prison fights in Mexican history erupted in Gómez Palacio Prison. It started with rival cartel affiliates, Los Zetas and Sinaloa. What began as a brawl quickly turned into an all-out massacre. Armed inmates broke into cell blocks, dragging rivals out of their bunks. Guns, knives, fire, everything was used. By dawn, 44 inmates lay dead. You couldn't tell who was winning. It was just death everywhere. People burned alive, some hacked to pieces. It wasn't a fight, it was extermination. Cartel influence is so strong that sometimes prison guards are caught aiding one side, even releasing inmates to carry out assassinations inside. Inmates are not just prisoners, they're soldiers. And Mexican prisons have become their battlegrounds. Ecuador's bloody prison wars. But perhaps no country today has seen prison violence like Ecuador. In just 2 years, over 400 inmates were slaughtered in wave after wave of brutal prison fights. Rival gangs, tied to cartels, turned prisons into slaughterhouses. In September 2021, the world watched in horror as Ecuador's deadliest prison fight erupted. Inmates armed with machetes, guns, and explosives rampaged through the cell blocks. Footage smuggled out showed bodies stacked in hallways, burned beyond recognition. Victims were decapitated. Some were dismembered and displayed as warnings. By the end, 118 lay dead, the worst prison massacre in Ecuador's history. Officials admitted they had lost control. The violence wasn't just about survival. It was about power, money, and cartel control. Ecuador's prisons became war zones, and the world got a chilling glimpse of what happens when entire nations lose control of their cages. The New Mexico Nightmare, 1980. It was one of the darkest nights in American correctional history, a night of fire, blood, and screams. In just 36 hours, the New Mexico State Penitentiary saw levels of violence so extreme that to this day, officials call it hell on earth. It began when inmates overpowered guards during a routine check. Within minutes, the locks were breached and hundreds of men flooded through the corridors. Order vanished. Gangs settled old scores, and the strong preyed on the weak. Inmates dragged rivals from their cells, torturing them with blowtorches and metal rods. Prisoners were dismembered. Some were decapitated. At least 33 men were murdered, many in ways too horrific to describe on the evening news. Guards barricaded outside listened helplessly as the violence raged. It wasn't a riot, it was a slaughterhouse. The New Mexico prison riot remains one of the bloodiest in U.S. history, a grim reminder that when control collapses, a prison can transform into a battlefield where humanity itself disappears. Comayagua, Honduras, death by fire. February 14th, 2012, Valentine's Day. While much of the world celebrated, Honduras woke up to its deadliest prison disaster. At Comayagua prison, what began as a fight turned into an inferno. A blaze tore through cell blocks packed with hundreds of inmates. Guards, panicked and underprepared, failed to open the doors in time. Trapped behind iron bars, men screamed as flames consumed them. By the end of the night, more than 350 prisoners were dead. It was less a fight and more a catastrophe, but at its heart lay the same issue: overcrowding, corruption, and a system stretched to the breaking point. Rikers Island, gang wars unseen. Rikers has long been New York City's hidden battlefield. While many fights go unreported, former inmates describe a culture where violence is constant, where gangs dictate survival, and where eruptions can leave dozens bloodied in minutes. In one infamous outbreak in 2015, two rival crews clashed inside the Anna M. Cross Center. The fight escalated so fast that by the time backup arrived, the floor was slick with blood. At least a dozen men were hospitalized, many with stab wounds from sharpened razors and shanks. On Rikers, you never know if breakfast ends in blood. That's life there. For many New Yorkers, Rikers is just an island in the East River. But for those inside, it's a war zone, one that erupts daily, hidden from the outside world. Angola, the farm that bleeds. Angola, once a slave plantation, now America's largest maximum security prison. Over 5,000 men serve time here, many for life. And when fights erupt inside these fields, they echo Angola's long and violent past. In 1999, a violent clash between rival groups left one man dead and several others hospitalized. But what makes Angola unique is how often its violence spills beyond fists and blades. Inmates here have staged uprisings, hostage takings, and gang wars, each one reminding guards that even the farm can erupt. The violence of Angola is woven into its history. It's not just a prison, it's a living monument to the darkest chapters of America. And when fights break out here, they carry the weight of that history. The global ripple. From the U.S. to Latin America, from Africa to Asia, prisons erupt with terrifying regularity. Some fights are small, forgotten within days. Others are cataclysmic, leaving nations shaken. But each tells the same story, that prisons are never just about walls and locks. They are living, boiling ecosystems where fear, power, and desperation collide. And when that collision comes, it leaves scars that last forever.